So good morning and welcome to all our participants in today's webinar, Evolution Atrophied, the Aborted Modernism in Indian Art. For the Regional Center of IGNCA based in Baroda, this is our first webinar with the support from our head office at Delhi, Indira Gandhi National Center for the Arts. And we are extremely thankful for this. And also thankful that Professor Deepak Kannal has agreed to deliver a presentation, an in-depth lecture on this subject. Before we move on to the main speaker, I would like to share with you all a few lovely moments that the Regional Center Vadodara had in the past few months, wherein we had various programs and exhibitions, and also certain workshops, some of them which came to us from our head office, various divisions in New Delhi, and some which were curated here. And this was just a few months before the lockdown. And then soon after lockdown, with the vision of our Member Secretary, Honorable Member Secretary, Dr. Sachchidanand Joshi ji, we have all moved on to the online platform of webinars and social media. This is our Indira Gandhi National Center for the Arts in New Delhi, as you all already know. An institute established under the Ministry of Culture, Government of India. It serves as a major resource center for all arts and undertakes research, publication, documentations of various art forms. And here we have the regional center in the cultural city, Vadodara, which is a cultural capital. It's a cultural hub in this region. On the one hand, we have the monuments, the historical monuments during the Maharaja Sayajirao Gaikwad's time, and we have the educational institute established like the MS University of Vadodara, which spearheads all the other educational institutes. We began our programs in August with a Natya therapy workshop, applied Natya therapy based on Natya Shastra. The Nari Samvad Prakalp division supported us on that. The Conservation Division brought to us the Museum Reorganization Workshop. We had also ICROM supporting us on that. The Media Center, with the collaboration, we had Pravah, a festival of films. And we have young speakers from Vadodara itself in collaboration with local institutes here. We presented the local culture of Garba during the Navaratri time, and Gujarat especially being known for Garba tradition. And we went on to the celebration of Vijayadashmi all across the country as a celebration of Kala and Vidya, wherein the various art forms are presented. And also we had eminent speaker, Dr. S.D. Desai, speak on arts with relevance to society, especially the performing arts. Then we had the Bukaru exhibition, the Children's Literature Festival here in Baroda, and there was a collaboration with the Alembic Space Studio. This was also sent to us from Delhi. With the management faculty, we tied up for a talk by Mr. V.K. Madhav Mohan on stories from Panchatantra for 21st century leadership. We had a beautiful exhibition for 10 days on calligraphic works, tying up with the Red Earth Gallery, which was again brought to us by the Conservation Department of IGNCA New Delhi. And under the Guru Nanak Dev Ji's 500 centenary celebrations, we had talk by eminent scholars. Kathakali was brought with the musicians and performed here at the Department of Dramatics. to encourage the theatre and the dance students to understand how the female roles were performed in Kathakali. We also have a lot of workshops for young children, drawing workshops. And the highlight was our talk by Honorable Member Secretary on manuscripts repository of Indian culture, wherein we tied up with the Faculty of Community Sciences. This was done under the NMM's Tattva Bodha lecture series. So now I would like to move on to our main event for this morning, wherein we have with us a very distinguished, learned scholar. He need not have any introduction among all the art fraternity and academicians. Yet, I would like to present to you Professor Deepak H. Kannal. Professor Deepak Kannal is an art historian, a sculptor, and a teacher. He taught at the Department of Art History and Aesthetics, Faculty of Fine Arts, MSU of Baroda. Shouldering the responsibilities as the head of the department and the dean of the faculty, he has a long list of publications that includes 2 books and a monograph, 5 edited volumes, 3 of them co-edited with Professor Parimo, 3 edited journals, 3 full-length plays, 3 dance dramas, and more than 70 papers and articles on art and aesthetics to his credit. He has organized and participated in many national, international seminars, has delivered series of lectures for coveted institutes in India, US, UK, and was invited on prestigious chairs instituted by various academies, museums, and universities. He is a recipient of a number of awards, scholarships, and distinctions in sculpture, theatre, and art history, including the Charles Wallace Fellowship at Cambridge, UK, National Lalit Kala Honorable Mention, Gujarat Lalit Kala Awards, AP Council National Award, the Gujarat Gaurav Puraskar, Raja Ravi Varma Samman, and the Tagore National Fellowship, under which he is working on the correspondence between Indian linguistics theories and Indian sculpture. So I request Dr. H. Kannal to kindly take it on from here.
Friends, you're on. You're on. Shall we switch over to the presentation?
Yes, Professor Deepak.
Yeah. I'll straight away switch over to my presentation because we have very little time. A couple of years back, I was invited by serendipity to make a presentation on 17th and 18th century sculpture in India. The presentation was a brief presentation, and I was not quite excited because this particular field. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, you are very much audible, Professor Deepak. Please continue.
I wasn't quite excited because this particular period is a neglected era in the history of Indian sculpture. Then again, I was invited to Pune to talk about Maratha sculpture. And while working on these sculptures, I realized that there is some potential in this study. Actually, I realized that from 13th to 17th century, the Indian sculpture almost went into hibernation, probably because of Islamic rule, because when 2 religions are negotiating spaces, it is very natural for each of that religion to get a little rigid about their tenets. And perhaps the strict codification which we see from 13th century to 17th century could be a result of this defense mechanism. After this, during the Maratha rule, you can see a conspicuous shift in the purpose, the technique, and the aesthetics of Indian sculpture. And that attracted me to the study of this particular phase. Now, I'll show you some examples. This is from Hampi. Now, the ossified sculptural language is very clearly seen over here, and it continues till Nayaka period, Vijayanagar period, Nayaka period. That technically, they are very ambitious. but aesthetically, they're totally ossified, they're totally stagnant. Now, the sculpture on the right is from 17th century. The one on the left is late Chola, and you hardly find any difference between the two. The same is true about stone sculpture, the same is true about Buddhist sculpture. The sculpture on the right is an early sculpture. On the left is an 18th century bronze. Now, the language is totally ossified. There is hardly any progression that is seen in this particular period. And that is why this is a very neglected period in the history of Indian sculpture. The period roughly between 13th and 17th century, as I said, is the period of ossified sensibility. Now, some ambitious sculpture has been created during Vijayanagar and Nayaka period. If you happen to go to Hampi sculpture is very, very ambitious. But it repeats the same aesthetic sensibility. It proves that the carving technology, the casting technology has been properly protected, but they are not adding anything further to it. It is not an expression of that particular age. They are not responding to the surroundings. They are following whatever has been done before in 10th, 11th, 12th century, and they are repeating the same thing again and again. The plastic aesthetics in this particular remains unquestioned. They don't inquire into the validity of those plastic aesthetics. And then we come across some extremely unusual sculptures. This particular sculpture is from Nayaka period, Tamil Nadu, and you can see that unlike the sculptures which we saw before, this sculpture is a secular sculpture and portrays the life of that particular era. This triggered off some curiosity in my mind, and when I inquired further, I came across some very interesting examples. Now, this period, here you can see the domestic reflection of domestic reality, and particularly the secular household artifacts like this. Most of these sculptures are in ivory. They are not very ambitious sculptures, but they are very significant sculptures. If they are compared with the religious temple sculpture of the same date bracket, this depiction is very different and is of contemporary life. But the pictorial conventions have not changed much. The pictorial aesthetics has not changed much. Now, when I was documenting the sculpture of this particular period, I came across a very interesting sculptural panel, which was found at a place called Yadwad in Karnataka. It is in Dharwad district. It is an equestrian portrait of the Maratha Emperor Shivaji. And very interestingly, it was carved in his own lifetime, that is around 1678 or so. Now, the story goes like this, that his lieutenants, while on their expedition to south, they annexed a small principality of a lady called Malevadi Mallamma and traveled further. When Shivaji came to know about it, he was very uncomfortable with this fact that a principality of a lady has been annexed. So he apologized to that lady and returned that. Now, that lady was so obliged that to mark her, she carved a sculpture for him. Actually, there is a temple for the emperor, and this sculpture has been placed in that temple. I think the lower register of this sculpture is very interesting, where the emperor is shown offering a glass of milk to the young prince, who is Mallamma's son. Now, this sculpture is extremely unusual. We have not come across any sculpture of this sort before this. And very interesting thing is the symbolic depiction of this subject matter, offering a glass of milk. This is 17th century, a detail of the same sculpture. Again, I will repeat the same thing, that though the subject matter and the depiction is very different, the aesthetics hasn't changed much. It doesn't depart much from the Nayaka aesthetics or the Nayaka stylization. In 18th century, the Mukhalingas also start changing. If you see the early Mukhalingas in South India, this is a usual practice that on certain occasions, they place a metal Mukhalinga on top of the Shivalinga. The earlier Mukhalingas are quite different, like the traditional sculpture. But here, you can see that they are representing certain characters they are not the typical stylized Mukhalingas. See, gradual change is there. And then I felt that this change certainly calls for some further inquiry. I am putting forward some observations and some postulates. They call for further thought. Now, I am not trying to say that this is a theory, because the material which I have examined is quite limited material. The other thing is, this is not the platform to put forward a theory, and we do not have enough time to construct and present a theoretical construct. I tried to understand Indian modern in the light of these cultures which I have documented. Now, so many people, so many important scholars have written about Indian modern. Geeta Kapoor, her When Was Modernism is considered to almost like a key essay in the study of modern Indian art. Yashodhara Dalmia has written on making of modern Indian art. Shivakumar presented a very different view about Bengal revivalism in his modern Indian art, a brief overview, where he tried to see the undercurrents of modernism in Bengal revivalism. Tapati Guha Thakurta has written about the making of new Indian art. P.R. Bolsani, how was modernism in Indian art? So there are so many people who have written about modernism and the emergence of modernism in Indian art. I'm not trying to contest any of them. Rather, I'm trying to propose an alternative possibility, which I noticed from the material which I studied. Now, a very simplistic derivation can be drawn from all these arguments and all the material which is known to us, that there are three different perceptions of modernism that can be observed in India. One, and particularly now we are shifting to the realm of art. The British academic art, which was introduced by the Britishers in the art schools, the modernity, it was as introduced by the British. The Bombay progressives tried to rebel against the British academism, but again, that rebel was not an independent rebel. It was not an indigenous rebel. It was modeled on the Western model. So, though it was voluntarily followed, unlike the British academic art, but it was again derived from the European model. The third is the Bengal revivalism, which may consider as alternative modernity, but it was again improvised modernity. It did not emerge naturally from the surroundings. It was thought over and was grafted and was improvised in the given situation. So these are the three different streams that we observe in modern Indian art. And when I was working on this particular period, I came across a long essay written by a very important historian called Arvind Deshpande, who was a professor and head of Department of History in Pune University. And another person who worked with him, Professor Raja Dikshit, who worked on the rise of middle class in India. They made some very interesting observations, and though they are in the context of the Maratha rule, I think in this context they are very important, because in 17th and 18th century, the Maratha Confederacy was extremely powerful in our country, and I think the political and social developments in India will have to be studied in the context of Maratha rule. Now we can see that most of the scholars treat modernism as a deterministic process. And whenever we talk about any evolution, we take into consideration this determinism. Now, Dipesh Chakrabarty has made a very interesting statement. He says, all headed in the same direction. Some arrived later. Europe arrived later, we followed them. Now, this kind of determinism, is it really there or not? We'll have to check. The other is the mimetic model, where whatever was introduced by the British rule was considered as modern. So, modernization and westernization were replaced by each other. These are the two views towards modernism in India, popular views, let's say. We are not taking into consideration all the views at this juncture. But most importantly and interestingly, Professor Deshpande contested the colonial narrative that the Indian society was stagnated, orthodox, and regressive when British rule came. He contested this particular narrative and tried to furnish a lot of data which which is quite contrary to this belief. Now, if you see the developments in 18th century, India was undergoing a major change even before the advent of British, according to Professor Deshpande, and I think what he furnishes does call for a serious thought. Economically, politically, geographically, and also culturally, these changes were taking place. Now, I noticed when I was reading through this essay, I noticed that the nomenclature Hindustan, now initially Hindustan was used by the outsiders to identify the northern part of Indian peninsula. But now, if you see in Peshwa Daftar or in other Daftars, the country is being mentioned as Hindustan by the people of Hindustan themselves. The perception is gradually changing. This land is getting an identity which is being accepted by the people of this land. I think this is a very interesting development. Now, the other thing which Professor Deshpande pointed out is the new political model. Marathas, this is a model which believes in hegemony and not in empire. And this is much before the East India Company. The model which was employed by the East India Company was introduced in India much before that by the Marathas. Perhaps some of you who are students of history might be knowing that Maharaja Shinde was the Wakil ul Mutlaq at Delhi. He was the regent of the empire. The empire is a medieval concept. The Marathas gone beyond that concept and they conquered different territories but never annexed them to their empire. They only believed in Chauthai and Sardeshmukhi. They used to get their share from the areas which they conquered. Now this is a different model being introduced for the first time in Indian history. Perhaps since the Britishers were also envisaging the same model, they considered Marathas as their real contestants. Do we notice that there were so many many princes in India, so many states in India, but Maratha Empire or the state of Peshwa is the only state which was totally ruined by Britishers. The rest of them survived, and the rest of them they collaborated with the British. The Marathas were totally ruined, particularly the Peshwas, and this has been very clearly, very categorically mentioned by Charles Metcalfe in 1803 and Warren Hastings in 1817. Now the Maratha Empire came to its end in 1825, totally, from 1815 to 1825. This is very, very interesting, very significant. Now, the decline and the resurrection of industry and economy, I wonder whether we have so much of time, but using the war of Panipat and using the phase after Aurangzeb, he has noted down some very interesting, he poses some very interesting questions, that the Maratha army of 1 lakh people traveled from Pune to Panipat. Now, the horses need their horseshoes. It is necessary to change the horseshoes after every 20 miles. So they must have needed lakhs and lakhs of horseshoes. Did we have enough blacksmiths to do this job? Did we have enough blacksmiths to make the weapons? Which perhaps means that so many people who did not inherit the business of blacksmith, they opted for that business. Even Peshwas, who were Brahmins, they switched over to the profession of Kshatriyas. Now, this was he has noted down some very interesting facts, and he says that we should not call it annihilation of caste, because the upper caste and lower caste, the distinction between the upper caste and the so-called lower caste was always there. But still, there is some movement between the castes in this particular period. Now, Sorokin has said that the radical change in the modes of generating and distributing the wealth is the basic reason of this revolution. So if we observe carefully, we can see a radical change in the industry. The balutedars now are not doing their traditional business; they are changing their business, switching over their business. The socio-cultural mobility is immense. People are traveling from one place to another. There are so many Maharashtrians who travel to North India and settle down over there. So many people from Kannal came to Maharashtra and settled down in Maharashtra. The decentralization of economy is also a very important feature of this particular period, and the development of banking system. Of course, this banking system is the indigenous banking system, but the banking system and a very developed, very advanced banking system can be seen in this particular period. This is the period when the Jains travel to different places and they set up their business in every corner of the country. So many things are happening. The flexibility of thinking and concepts can be observed in this particular period. So this period is a very turbulent period. This period is a very happening period, and the Indian society is radically changing from this. When I was talking about our post-Aurangzeb phase, scholars have observed that during the after the rule of Aurangzeb, the Indian industry and the Indian economy suffered a tremendous setback. In 18th century, the Indian economy is again looking up. It is getting resurrected. This resurrection is very, very important and must be taken into consideration. Keeping these things in mind, I know I spoke very cursorily on these issues. They do call for further discussion, but in the given time, it may not be possible for us. So let's see the Indian sculpture of 18th century on this background. This is an image of Parvati with Ganesha in ivory from Bengal. Now here, Parvati almost looks like Pietro, or let's say it's almost an Indian version of Mother and Child. The same can be seen in Kalighat painting. The images that we saw earlier of Parvati and Ganesha, that model is not being followed by these artists. They are discovering their own model. The codified iconography is denied by these artists. Some of these artists are from the popular tradition, but even the elite tradition has started accepting this rebel. Now these are two ivories, Christian ivories from India, and the sculpture which we saw before of Parvati and Ganesha owes a lot to these ivories. So we can see that it is not merely an influence of one culture on another. It is an healthy interaction, willingly done. It is a willful interaction between different traditions. And these traditions could be religious traditions. These traditions could be state traditions. These traditions could be the interaction between the non-elite and the elite and the popular. So the elite tradition interacting with non-elite and the popular tradition, or the one art form interacting with another art form, like sculpture interacting with painting, painting interacting with sculpture. All these interactions are very, very, very important, because that watertight compartmentation, which was introduced by the strict codification from 13th to 17th century, is being denied by these artists. Now, this is a folk sculpture, but found in an elite context. In the first sculpture, you can see Ravana with 10 heads. The other is Wali and Sugriva, a typical folk Rajasthani sculpture. But this idiom has been accepted by the elite tradition. In Gujarat, we have very elaborate wood carvings, particularly in Saurashtra region, in Kheda region. And there, this particular idiom, which normally is considered to be the folk or popular idiom, is found in the elite tradition. The elite tradition has accepted this popular tradition. This interaction, I think, is very important and very healthy. A very interesting sculpture from Siddheshwar temple of Kaigao Toke, which is in Ahmednagar district. Now here, the depiction of Ravana is extremely interesting. And I'm reminded of the depiction of Ravana from the 17th century Mewar manuscript in the collection of Bhandarkar Oriental Institute. So now see the hands of Ravana here, which are borrowed by the sculptor. Again, the same interaction. Now, like the elite tradition is borrowing from the popular tradition, and the popular tradition is also borrowing from the elite tradition. Here, the iconography, or not exactly the iconography, but the mythology, elite mythology, the mainstream mythology is being depicted by the popular tradition, and they are taking the liberty to depict it their way. Here, Parshurama is seen slaying his mother Renuka, and now Parshuram is not the incarnation of Vishnu, and Renuka is not the supreme mother goddess. Now they are like two villagers. The lady is being slayed by the man. A very simplistic, very dynamic depiction of this myth. I'm sure that the Christian sculpture in Goa and other colonial areas also must have played a very important role in formulating the new language of this particular era. I'm showing the same sculpture again, which we have seen before. But all these ivory sculptures seem to have left a very deep impact on Brahmanical sculpture. Putana from Kerala. It is almost like a Romanesque sculpture. Again, as I said, that the popular tradition is interacting with the mainstream tradition, and the mainstream tradition is getting enriched because of that tradition. And in 18th century, you can see that in Orissa, you can see this interaction. In Rajasthan, you can see it. In North India, you can see it. Now there is a very healthy exchange is taking place. And the subject matter. The subject matter is most important. Till now, except the religious subject, we did not have much of a sculpture other than that. This sculpture, one of the most interesting sculptures carved in 18th century, is Tipu's tiger. And I'm sure many of you must have seen these photographs earlier, which is in the collection of Victoria and Albert Museum, London today. And there is a liver which is embedded in the tiger's body, and by operating that lever, you can make that tiger roar, and the soldier roll with pain. Now, this is a very new interpretation of sculpture, and very new understanding of sculpture, new perspective about sculpture. We are shifting to southern part of the country. This is from Tanjore. And the painted sculpture from Tanjore is again a very different perspective of sculpture. Most importantly, I think the reflection of contemporary life. We talk about realism, we talk about romanticism. And Courbet is considered to be a great artist because he tried to portray the life around him. He refused to portray the angels because he had never seen them. I think the sculptor of 18th century India is exactly doing the same. He's trying to portray the life which he sees around him, and the patronage is also accepting his perspective. The patronage rather is encouraging the people, and you can see it in painting. But in sculpture also, these trends are percolating. A very realistic portrayal, again in it is a monochromatic ivory. Many of these ivories are painted. And a painted sculpture from Varanasi, from Peshwa Mandir. Now, perhaps a sculpture made by a North Indian sculptor, inspired by a Deccan topic. This is a temple called Trishunda Ganpati in Pune, built over the end of 18th century. And very interestingly, you find there are many other sculptures, but the most interesting part of it was the two rhinos carved on it. Now, rhinos are not known in Maharashtra. We were talking about the radical changes in every strata of life. This is the geographic understanding of the country. Now the people are traveling so much; they are going to faraway corners of the country, getting acquainted with that life, and the reflections of those things can be seen in that sculpture. The sculptor is responding to his own experiences. I think that is the most important factor of 18th century sculpture, which we never see before. One more depiction of the same topic. And we come to one of the most affluent states of Maratha Confederacy. We know that in 17th and 18th century, a large part of northern India was ruled by the Maratha rulers. In central India, the Holkars were ruling, and in northern part of the country, from Gwalior, the Scindias. Holkars are also very affluent, and Ahilyabai Holkar, the daughter-in-law of Mallara Holkar, she played a very important role in formulating the cultural ethos of this particular period. She is the lady who has given handsome donations to different structures all over the country. And she saw to it that they are built under her supervision or the supervision of her ministers. The people who are conversant with Ellora, they must have seen a temple very close from the Ellora cave complex, known as Krishneshwara in Ellora village. That temple and the sculpture of that temple is also very interesting. Unfortunately, I could not get time to document these sculptures for this particular purpose this time. But that sculpture and the sculpture from Maheshwar, from the Ghats of Maheshwar, are some of the most interesting examples of 18th century sculpture. Now see the clothes which they are wearing. They are wearing 9-yard saris, a very faithful depiction of the life around. You can see different types of warriors. The warrior on the right. Now, this is the period when there were mercenaries from different parts of the country and from outside the country also. There are so many Arabs who were working as mercenaries in Maratha armies. So all these people can be seen distinctly in the sculpture of Maheshwar. Now see the person on the left and the person on the right. They are from different lineages. Here, obviously, it is a depiction of a Brahmin minister. This is from the Ahilya Fort Ghat from Maheshwar. And this Chodar. Now, even the facial expressions, the demeanor, it changes from sculpture to sculpture. I think that is the most important thing. And that leads us to a realization that the schematization, which was an invariable part of Indian sculpture from 13th to 17th century, that all the people looked alike. Every character looked alike. There was no individual depiction, individual rendering. The breaking of that schematization can be seen in Maheshwar. Now they are not following schemas. They are following the live models and trying to depict them as faithfully as possible. I think this is the highlight of Maheshwar sculpture. If you see carefully, there is an Englishman with tall boots. You can see the frock coat if you see it carefully. And a hat. He's dancing, and the dance obviously is the close European dance. That is not an Indian dance, with an Indian courtesan. Now she is wearing the Indian costume, and she is engaged in a dance with English. Now, I think this is amazingly different than the rest of the sculpture of India. the point of departure. The medieval model has been left behind. The medieval politics has been left behind. The medieval economy is left behind, and the medieval sculpture is also left behind. And the new sculpture, which is getting more and more realistic. Now, when I am talking about the realism, actually I should have brought some examples from Bharat and Mathura. If you see a Gandhara sculpture and Bharat sculpture, they are radically different from each other. Gandhara sculpture is highly realistic and divulges a very obvious influence of Greco-Roman tradition, which is a realistic, naturalistic tradition. Bharat sculpture is extremely stylized, very naive to some extent, but it evolves very fast. And by the time Bharat idiom reaches Mathura, a very different kind of naturalism is developed in Mathura sculpture. Mathura sculpture is highly naturalistic. If you see the Mathura Yakshi, so-called Yakshis, they are very, very naturalistic, but that naturalism is not the European, not the Greco-Roman naturalism. It is a depiction of Indian anatomy. It is a depiction of Indian beauty. It is an understanding, independent understanding of human figure, which is radically different than the European understanding of human. Now, the same understanding can be seen in this sculpture also. Perhaps a couple of examples from Mathura would have been extremely useful to plead my point. But if you see this sculpture is very, very naturalistic, but this naturalism is not European naturalism. This naturalism is not the academic naturalism which was taught in the academic schools, in the art schools established by Britishers. Now, when Indian sculpture reached this stage, when Indian sculpture reached its own realism, I'm purposely using the term realism, not naturalism, because now it is a discovery of naturalism as well as realism of India by the end of 18th century. And when it is gradually flourishing, that is the time when the British art schools are established in India. The modernism, the understanding of the modern world, which was being comprehended by the Indian artist, by the Indian sculptor, at that juncture, there was a rupture in the Indian sculptural tradition. As it is, the visual arts in India have faced ruptures repeatedly. This is a major rupture. The tradition almost was put to an end, and a new tradition, which did not belong to this land, was introduced to Indian sculptors. The rest of Indian sculpture, like the Ganpati makers of India, the idol makers of India, are referred to with great contempt by the British writers on art, because they do not consider them as artists, they are considered as artisans. But at the same time, a large number of artists from the academic tradition were also doing the same job. If you walk on the road of Chowpatty in Mumbai, there is a studio on Chowpatty, and it says it is an old a board, signboard, which is hanging on that shop, that they can make trophies, they can make medals, they can make cups, they can make portraits, everything is available over there. So the same job was done by the Indian artists, but those artists were considered artisans. They were not recognized by the mainstream tradition, and this evolution was literally aborted. It came to an end abruptly. It came to it was put to an end in an abrupt fashion, and the new tradition was imposed on India. But some of the Indian Western artists who were working in India, they perhaps were fascinated by the Indian tradition, and they tried to echo these aesthetics in their sculpture. Now see the seated woman on the elephant, or the elephant itself, which is straight away lifted from the Indian tradition. This is a sculpture by John Henry Foley, which is used in Albert Memorial, London in 19th century. So those people are realizing that the Indian aesthetics is different than the British academic aesthetics, and they are trying to exploit it in their sculpture. But on the other hand, we can see these art schools which are radically changing the aesthetic understanding, the plastic understanding of Indian students. So this is the end of that modernism which just started emerging, which was just taking shape, which was growing and discovering itself, and abruptly it was put to an end by these traditions, by these art schools. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Yes. I think I'm in time.
Yeah, you are very much even before time. You could have.
I should speak for 45 minutes.
That absolutely no problem, because I'm sure the viewers have a lot of questions and they would like to interact with you also. So I would also like to mention here that we have our Honorable Member Secretary, Professor Dr. Sachchidanand Joshi ji here with us, who is chairing this day's program. Welcome, sir. It's so refreshing and encouraging to have you on board, and we will look forward to your valuable comments at the end of the session. And also we have Professor Ramesh C. Gaur, who has been silently supporting us since the beginning of this webinar, which gives us a lot of confidence. Thank you, sir, for observing in silence and supporting. Sir, can we take a few questions from the audience now?
Sure. Will they be text?
Yeah, just a minute. I can have a word with Joshi, sir.
No, there are few questions in the question box.
Yes.
Which you can see and respond. And actually, someone has also put some questions in the chat box. I was seeing those also. So,
yes, sir.
In the meanwhile, if Aishwarya, you can help sir in
the questions.
His questions.
Yes.
So I think he may respond to 2-3 questions if he wants.
Yeah. So then after the question session, sir, I would really appreciate if you can give your valuable comments about today's.
Sure.
Yes. So before we move on to the question, I have to definitely make one interesting observation today as I listened to Professor Kannal's whole presentation. Though I am from the field of dance, but art cannot be separated. In Vaikyam Kshetram also, I have seen this influence wherein there are sculptures of, they are not very early sculptures, they are in the Kshetram entrance. They are sculptures of dancers and even of various Krishna and various Salabanchika sculptures. Along with that, I have seen sculptures of people in kind of British era costumes with carrying guns. So this is exactly what you are mentioning, which I related now to what I had seen there.
There must be many. Actually, I wanted to work on this topic. When you asked me to talk on modernism, I offered to talk on this area because this area is luring me since years. But I have yet to do my documentation. I have yet to do a proper documentation. And I'm sure when I'll be able to travel and document the material, I'll find many more things.
Yes,
these are the things which I already have.
Yes. So I'll just take a few questions from our Q&A. We have one from Dr. Ramesh Chand Meena. भारतीय कला पर पाश्चात्य कला का क्या सकारात्मक प्रभाव पड़ा?
कोई भी प्रभाव वैसे जो होता है वो सकारात्मक तो होता ही है. किसी भी दो ट्रेडिशंस की जो इंटरेक्शन होती है वो सकारात्मक ही होती है. मगर भारतीय कला के बारे में ऐसे हुआ कि प्रभाव दिखाने के लिए भारतीय कला जिंदा तो रहनी चाहिए ना. भारतीय शिल्प पर प्रभाव नहीं पड़ा, भारतीय शिल्प हटाया गया और यूरोपियन शिल्प यहाँ पे बिठाया गया. प्रॉब्लम वहां पर है. तो इसको तो हम सकारात्मक प्रभाव नहीं कह सकेंगे. ये जो हमने इसमें देखा कि प्रभाव था और वो प्रभाव जो था वो सकारात्मक प्रभाव. जैसे गांधार कला का प्रभाव मथुरा कला पर पड़ा, वो सकारात्मक प्रभाव. मगर यहाँ पे ऐसे हुआ कि भारतीय कला जो है वो पूरी, भारतीय शिल्प जो है वो पूरी तरह से हटाया गया और यूरोपियन शिल्प वहां पे बिठाया गया. हम भारतीय शिल्प तो भूल ही गए.
बिल्कुल. Another anonymous attendee has asked us, what were some of the characteristics of the academic British art that aborted and replaced Indian modernism? Was it regressive? He asks.
What is regressive?
Is it regressive that the
European tradition? The academic tradition, British academic tradition as it is was considered to be regressive in the Western world. By the time this tradition was introduced to us, and it was in the beginning of 20th century, Europe was engaged in toying with possibilities of cubism, formalism. Europe has already entered into high modernism by that time. So what we were doing in the beginning of 20th century in India was regressive, though it was Western. And that is why the people like why Bombay progressives wanted to revolt against the academic tradition, because they found the tradition regressive.
Another anonymous attendee asks, what is the relevance of masculature as in Greco-Roman sculpture in Indian sculpture? Sir,
what is the difference?
He is asking what is the relevance of masculature as in Greco-Roman sculpture in Indian sculpture.
I didn't understand what exactly.
Yeah.
Does it want to?
We can move on to another question. When the artisans were left behind, because that was an interesting point you made, sir, about artists being called as artisans. Maybe that's how this question has come up. When the artisans were left behind, were removed from so-called art school, what could be the probable reasons of artisans not being able to take further the code that they have discovered themselves? Artisans were not the students of this art school? Probably the person wants to ask.
Some of the artisans, actually it happened in some of the cases, the traditional artisans, they, with the help of some small chieftains or states, they could seek admission in the art school. And then, like they were traditional artisans. I know a person from Sangli. He was a traditional artisan called Dattoba Otari, and the ruler of Sangli state, he sought admission for this artisan in JJ School of Art. But after joining JJ School of Art, he left his tradition and switched over to the academic tradition. So either they had to leave their own tradition or they had to leave the profession.
Yes, sir. We'll take one last question here, and I would request the other questions, if they can be sent to the mail ID that they have, we will forward it and get the reply from Deepak sir. This person is Amitava Adhikari. He asked, very interesting, he says, and thought-provoking presentation. Sir, can you talk something about your observations on relief sculptures on terracotta temples of Bengal for the same period?
Yes, actually they are very important. But again, there the subject matter is mainly religious. But at the same time, I have come across some reliefs which are secular in nature. And in this context, they do call for a proper documentation and study. Yes, good. I think that is an important contribution to Indian sculpture. And I'm sorry, I have not studied it very carefully, but I have seen some of them. And I'm sure they will prove to be very relevant in this investigation.
I have one question to Professor Deepak. Professor Deepak, very thought-provoking talk. I really was listening, and it is the way you orated everything. It was very clear and very, very interesting. You mentioned about that Maratha conquered many princely states, but they never annexed to their. Any particular thought behind it, or have you come across any philosophy behind this particular philosophy or policy they have adopted during this?
The British policy.
Talking about Marathas' policy, that you mentioned that they conquered many princely states, yes, but they didn't annex to their.
They actually the modern model is like the post medieval model is they do not take the responsibility of governing that area. Instead, it is just a hegemony. They get some money as protection fee, and just this is almost a kind of nuisance value fee. We will not trouble you, and for that you will be paying this much of money to us.
Yeah, so that is they are getting certain kind of money against their
for giving protection. Britishers exactly did the same thing. The Britishers, they gave protection, they gave army to the states and took the share of their revenue. Marathas, and the percentage was decided according to the state. Chauthai is 1/4 of the revenue. Sardeshmukhi is that is the more flexible model. The percentage of the revenue will be decided according to the requirements. So there are different percentages, which is very similar to the British model.
Thank you, Professor Deepak. Over to Aishwarya.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. I've been noticing, many participants are also putting questions in the chat box as Member Secretary observed. So maybe just one question I will take last to do justice to them. Dr. Sandeep Kumar has asked, क्या वजह है कि आदिवासी कला जैसे डोकरा शिल्प जैसी कलाएं में आधुनिकता कला के समक्ष नहीं रखकर तिरस्कार की समक्ष नहीं रख तिरस्कार की दृष्टि से देखी जाती है, उनको आधुनिक कला जितना सम्मान क्यों नहीं मिलता है?
बात तो है कि मगर मुझे लगता है कि ये जो सवाल आपने पूछा, सवाल बिल्कुल ठीक है, मगर ये सवाल जो है वो एस्थेटिक्स के फील्ड का नहीं है, ये जो है ये इकोनॉमिक्स के फील्ड का है। आर्ट और आर्ट मार्केट ये दो अलग चीजें हैं। मुझे नहीं लगता कि बस्तर की कला को या तो डोकरा कास्टिंग को कोई हीन भावना से देखता है। वी लुक एट इट विद ग्रेट रिस्पेक्ट, हम उस ट्रेडिशन को बहुत रिस्पेक्ट, मगर जिस तरह से वो आर्ट प्रोडक्शन होता है वो आर्ट मार्केट में बहुत ज्यादा टिक इसलिए नहीं सकता क्योंकि उसको जो एक्सोटिका का जो एलिमेंट है वो हम चिपका नहीं सकते। यहाँ पे एक आर्टिस्ट को आप आइडेंटिफाई करो कि ये ग्रेट मास्टर है, फिर उसकी कला जो है वो ज्यादा दामों में बेची जा सकती है, इसकी वजह से उसकी कीमतें बढ़ने लगती है। तो ये जो है ये मार्केट का पॉलिटिक्स है, उसका कला के दर्जे के साथ कोई उसका संबंध है नहीं। तो बात आपने कही है वो बिल्कुल सही है, मगर उसके लिए कला क्षेत्र जिम्मेदार नहीं है, कला का मार्केट जिम्मेदार।
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. Like I mentioned earlier, it is very encouraging that our Honorable Member Secretary has taken time out of his busy schedule to be here. I noticed, sir was silently listening. He was cued in, and he had a very, he didn't want to disturb what was happening, so he had muted his audio and camera, and sir was observing the whole session. A few words about the Member Secretary. Professor Dr. Sachchidanand Joshi, the Executive Academic Head, the Member Secretary of Indira Gandhi National Center for the Arts, IGNCA. He is an educationist, scholar of history and mass communication, a writer, a poet, and an actor. He was the founder, Vice Chancellor of Kushabau Thakre University of Journalism and Mass Communication, Raipur. He was also the founder registrar and later the Dean Academics of Makhanlal Chaturvedi National University of Journalism and Communication, Bhopal. He has written extensively on media, communication, history, culture, education, policy, and other issues, and also delivered a number of lectures on communication, gender sensitization, research for resurgence, personality development, and art and culture. Some of his published works include सच्चिदानंद जोशी की लोकप्रिय कहानियां, कुछ अल्पविराम, पल भर की पहचान, and his speeches have been compiled into 2 volumes titled Mera Desh, Mera Dharm. I would request sir to kindly give his concluding remarks and throw and share some more lights and vision about IGNCA, what he thinks, how we should take all this forward.
Thank you, Dr. Aishwarya Warrior, who is the Regional Director of IGNCA. Thank you, Professor Deepak Kannal. It was really an enlightening lecture. Actually, I am not a student of art history and I am not a student of actually in modern art also. But for a learner like me, for a beginner like me, it was an eye opener. Uh, my colleague, Professor Dr. Ramesh Gaur, is also here, and I could see more than 300 participants already there in this webinar, which is an encouraging thing, because this is a very highly specialized subject, and we know that until someone has really interest and some knowledge about this, he will not be able to really grasp what you are saying, Professor. But we all know that Professor Deepak, is an eminent art historian and a sculpturist, and he has traveled quite extensively within India and abroad, and he has compared the art and sculptures throughout the country, and he has really written extensively about these things. So it is a really pleasure of having a person like him to speak in this webinar, and we know that for this subject it is very difficult for a person to virtually explain everything, because unless you physically see the things or sense those things in your close vicinity, it's very difficult to virtually visualize everything. But you have created a world of beautiful sculptures around us, and it is very difficult for us to get out of that for substantial time. I am sure that the students who are from the field of art history or from the modern art or visual art would have been immensely benefited by this extremely scholarly lecture of Professor Deepak. Very interesting things. I joined a little late, but in fact, I could listen to almost 3/4 of your lecture, and things which you have narrated were eye openers. And when you said that how Hindustan word came from and how it has been originated, it is really a matter of knowledge for most of us, that how these words emerged and how with the words the entire philosophy of the psychology emerged and things came out. Many of us really even don't realize that the word Hindu itself was not given by the Indians. In our old text, there is no word like Hindu. It is Sanatan Dharma. It is not Hindu Dharma. Hindu word has been coined by people who came from other country, because I mean those things have to be understood. What is the origin of the word and how it has been coined. So these things in today's scenario must be understood, and when we contextualize something, unless we go into the details of the logic and history of those things, it is not possible for us to actually contextualize. And if we superficially contextualize these things, only we are putting ourselves in trouble, and we are misguiding the lot who is not aware or informed. So I am happy that in this webinar we have some extremely knowledgeable audience also, who are equally competent and knowledgeable people, and they would understand the nuances of contextualizing something or interpreting something with the proper background of history and facts. When we say about art, we know that art cannot exist in vacuum. It will not survive in vacuum. It need to have some kind of correlation with the society. Unless the art has the correlation with the society, or unless it has correlation with the economics, unless it has correlation with the politics, or unless it has correlation with the religious practices and beliefs or rituals, art cannot exist. We often say that art is a part of imagination, but even that imagination also is driven out of some kind of source or some kind of correlation with that environment. And when we say environment, it is the prevailing environment which really do some kind of an impression on the expression of art. Artist may know about that impression, or he may not know about this impression, but knowingly or unknowingly, that impression also comes out in the expression of art. I thought Aishwarya would read that question, which was very interesting. Somebody asked about when somebody is doing repetition, the term plagiarism was not there. I mean, that I do not I do not remember the name of the participant who has asked, but the participant asked something about plagiarism. If you are doing the plagiarism, why these things were copied or something like that. I just want to say that it is plagiarism is a comparatively modern term, and which is more prevalent in these days, especially after the introduction of digital world, and we all are virtually surviving on these virtual world. But I think copy, impression, and inspiration. These three things are entirely different. Actually, even if you are not using the word plagiarism, an artist or a student of art history must understand the difference between copying something, getting impression of something, or getting inspired from something. And I don't think there is any harm in doing either of the things if you are honest to your submission. Even if you are copying something, and if you say that I have copied this idea from XYZ, there is no harm. But if you try to propagate some idea, saying that this is your own original idea and generated from your own imagination, then you are doing a crime which is not acceptable. And becoming impressionist, in fact, I don't know, I'm not a student of actually modern art, but the whole impression theory prevailed for a substantial period in the field of art, and these impression theories also evolved in some kind of socio-political changes in the society. So that impressionist theory prevails, and if an artist gets an impression through that, there is no harm. And I will say that a true artist is the one who really gets inspired from his socio cultural environment which is prevailing around him or her. And inspired is something which is entirely different, and it is like following the footsteps and creating something new or evolving something new out of the inspiration which is the original sort of thing. So those things have to be taken into consideration as the knowledge grows, as the field of Professor Ramesh Gaur is there. He's a man of information sciences. He knows the world of universe of knowledge term which is prevalent in his science. But as the knowledge grows, we come across the new terminologies, like even in the field of art, there was an ancient art, then the medieval art, then the modern art, then now people talk about postmodern art, and now tomorrow somebody will coin the term as post-COVID art. And there has to be a post-COVID art, because the entire world is going to rethink about everything. And when we say everything, it also covers art. In fact, the major expression of post-COVID scenario is going to come through the expression of art. It may be a piece of sculpture, it may be a piece of painting, it may be a piece of dance, it may be a piece of music, it may be a piece of literature. And that is what we see, because we all are there on social media, and every day we see somebody is putting a beautiful poem on a social media platform, or somebody is putting up a beautiful piece of dance, or somebody is putting up a beautiful piece of music, some beautiful piece of painting which is coming. And these all are they all are expression. And I must tell you that it is too early to say it is a post-COVID scenario, because the COVID pandemic is not over. So we need to have patience. We need to rethink about the impressions of the post-COVID, because we really don't know how the society is going to take shape in years to come. Because after 45, 50 days lockdown, we all realized that we all have internalized so many things, and we have realized the truth, and everything is now new, fair. But we hardly saw the change when the liquor shops were allowed to open for 2 days, and all those norms of social distancing collapsed, and people ran to those shops without realizing the damage. So I mean, it's a small example. I'm not blaming any person, but what I'm trying to say, it is too early to predict, or too early to say what would exactly be the post-COVID scenario. But once it happens, then of course the major impression about that scenario would come through the expression of art. And as Professor Deepak has very rightly said, that the convergence which we are seeing in these modern eras, like there is a conversion between 2 or 3 or 4 different styles of art. If you happen to see the exhibitions these days, I had recently visited the Delhi Art Gallery exhibition, and I realized there was a convergence of different mediums of art, or different styles of expressions in one form, and art that artist is trying to evolve something different. So we do not know what is going to happen after the COVID pandemic is really over and the civilization has realized what all it has lost and what all it has to recoup or recover, or from where we have to start the process of repairing, recouping, and recovering. So these things have to be understood in a minute details, and I think the artists are the best persons to find out these details and to convey it to the society. So now the onus is on the artist to start visualizing those things and really think about those things. What all Deepak ji has said about the impression related to the British period, impression related to the modern Indian sculpture, which I could see the Parvati Ganesh Murti, which was he said that it is impressioned by the mother and child marble piece, and that kind of an impression came. But now it is time, since we have resources, since we are exposed to many references, we can also find out the roots from where exactly this mother and child has been brought. Do we find some kind of an impression available in our Indian ancient art of similar pattern, so that we can also find out whether it has traveled from west to east, or it has returned back from west to east. I mean, it might have traveled from east to west first, and then it has returned back to because it is for the researchers and scholars to find out how these impressions really travel. In fact, if you see the faces of these sculptures, even the faces have changed during the course of time. If you compare some faces of, say, 1,000 years back, or 1500 AD, and then you compare the faces of, say, 1800 or 1900, you will see an entirely different kind of a faces and ears, the depiction of lips, everything is getting transformed and getting impressioned because of the change in the society and change in the social status of the society. So even that is an impression which needs to be studied. It will not be out of text to tell you that Indira Gandhi National Center for the Arts has a fantastic collection of the ace photographer Raja Deen Dayal. Between 1845 to 1890, it is the one of the rarest photo collection. We all know Raja Deen Dayal had been the pioneering photographer of photoing portraits and group photographs. But I mean, it is our earnest desire that some scholar of aesthetics, or some scholar of jewelry, or some scholar of textile, or some scholar of art studies those photographs and brings out a document what kind of jewelry at that time was prevailed, or what kind of a costume was there, or what kind of a style was there. In fact, even the hairstyle. So I mean, these varieties, these things change according to the time, and as the time progresses, as the society grows, these things get changed. So we have to all take into account all these things, and then only we can make our own impression. It is high time that the Indian art creates its own impression on the world of art, and we should not bank upon someone else to acknowledge or recognize our element. Because the variety which India has, I don't think any country in the world has that kind of a variety in the expression of art. India has a tremendous variety. You go from south to north or east to west, each and every state is full of varieties and expressions in art. Somebody asked me, Professor Saab, related to the Dokra art of Bastar. So let me tell you, I was there in Chhattisgarh for 10 years, and I know some people who have created remarkable piece of Bastar art. But हिंदी में एक शब्द है जिसको कहते हैं आढ़तिया. आढ़तिया वो होता है जो किसान से अनाज खरीदता है और मंडी में लाता है, और मंडी में लेके फिर वो व्यापारी को बेच देता है. I will not call this person as middleman. आढ़तिया is a very nice colloquial term. तो ये जब से कला में जो आढ़तिया लोग आ गए हैं, तो कला में जो आढ़तिया लोग आ गए हैं, उन्होंने बस्तर की जो ढोकरा आर्ट है उसको बहुत सस्ते दाम में खरीद के बम्बई या दिल्ली या इंटरनेशनल मार्केट में उसे बहुत, यानी 10 गुना और 20 गुना दामों में बेचा है. मेरा ही खुद का अनुभव है कि जो जो पीस बस्तर में 250 और 300 रुपया भी हमको लगता था महंगा है, वही पीस मुंबई या दिल्ली के किसी एम्पोरियम में, किसी बड़ी प्रेस्टिजियस आर्ट शॉप में मैंने वो 2000 और 2500 में बिकते हुए देखा है। और दुर्भाग्य की बात यह है कि ये जो बीच का जो पैसा है, ये जो गैप है, ये उस आर्टिस्ट को नहीं मिल रहा है, बल्कि कई आर्टिस्ट तो किलो के भाव से अपने आर्ट पीसेस भी बेचते हैं। तो ये भी एक दुर्भाग्य है। इसको कहीं न कहीं हमको इसका एक बैलेंस बनाना ज़रूरी है, इसका एक कहीं न कहीं एक समन्वय, एक संतुलन बनाना ज़रूरी है। कैसे वो जो सचमुच जो कलाकार है, जो रियल आर्टिज़न है, वो कैसे अपनी चीज़ों का सही नॉट ओनली दाम, इट इज़ नॉट दाम, इट इज़ आल्सो क्रेडिट, कि उसको सही क्रेडिट भी मिले। ये एक बहुत बड़ी समस्या है जिस पर भी हमको सोचना चाहिए। We also must think that how our artisan has is is getting converted into, must see what are the compulsions because of which my artist in the rural area is leaving his traditional art and traditional skill and traditional intellect and coming to different cities for only earn bread and butter. So is the society helping them out in some kind of survival and bringing back their esteem and prestige to the field of art? ये बहुत गंभीर विषय है, बहुत ही मुझे लगता है कि चिंतन की जरूरत है, and I am happy that the interaction like this not only gives us knowledge about these things but also helps us in thinking within ourselves or within a group of our own intellectual people, that how we can really develop an environment where these arts flourish and where the artists really get credit out of it. हम लोग अक्सर कंबोडिया की बात करते हैं और कंबोडिया के मंदिर की बहुत तारीफ करते हैं, but how many of us have really seen the art which is available in Humphrey, which is not lesser than, in fact I would reckon it as much better and much clearer depiction, expression as compared to Cambodia. तो इतनी जो हमारे even in our own country also we have so much wealth as far as art is concerned spread throughout the country. So we must feel proud of them, and we must know how to preserve, how to take care of them, and also how to depict or how to explain or how to give the information to the world in a more positive and more vocal manner. I hope that I have not exceeded the time limit, and I could put my things, but because I belong to Madhya Pradesh, it was nice to see the reference of Holkars and Krishna Bai ki Chhatri, which is there in Maheshwar. And I think many of us who had the opportunity to visit to Maheshwar must have seen the beautiful things, monuments which have been created during the Holkar period, and they are absolutely majestic. And in fact, those who see movies, films, they must know that there are many films where the ghats are shown of Maheshwar only. Sometimes we mistake it as the ghats of Varanasi or somewhere else, but they are all the ghats of Maheshwar. So beautiful piece of art is prevailing there. In totality, we have so much to see, so much to realize, so much to understand, and lectures like this give us an insight and impetus and inspiration to again and again visit our country and see the expressions of arts spread throughout the length and breadth of the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your valuable insight and not only bringing out the sensitive observations of Deepak Kannal sir through his presentation, but also elaborating on that and explaining how important it is for us Indians to look into our own tradition and culture and to gain strength from that and go forth. And yes, I did miss that about plagiarism. It was nice of you to bring it up. It is interesting in today's time, because when nobody ever asked Jayadeva whether it was his own or not, and when so many other similar to Ashtapadi in different languages, Gita Govindas came into various other paintings and music also, it was only known as an inspiration and not as plagiarism. So this is an interesting thought, definitely, and you have highlighted that. Thank you so much, sir. And Deepak Kannal sir's, presentation has been so marvelous that so many messages have been coming constantly. And students, PhD scholars, and academicians are all complimenting and congratulating. Because seeing those visuals, I think all the pictures were all of very top quality with high resolution, and they're all very much researched. And you have amazing archives of pictures with you. Sir, you yourself are a university, I would say, and no wonder so many students and people have keyed in today to hear your lecture. And also, that was an interesting remark where you spoke about realism and naturalism and about Indian art and how the art form which should have grown in a continuous manner may have abruptly broken and may have been influenced in another way. Something for us to really think about for the future. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Professor Ramesh Gaur, sir, for supporting us on this whole event of webinar. And like I mentioned earlier, without the support of our head office, Indira Gandhi National Center for the Arts, the motivation of our member secretary and all our divisional heads there, our regional center would not have been able to put forth this. Though our key subject is modern art and Indian art, we do look forward to do more such events with all of your support. And I want to also thank Ms. Priya Sharma from NEGD, the portal which we are using, the Government Cultural Department's Zoom portal. Thank you, Priya, for supporting us on this.